The world revolves around the idea that money is valuable. Gigantic moments in history, major upheavals, incredible exchanges of power, single monumental changes in the world at a global scale, all of these caused by money, or the effects of money. Publius Syrus of Rome wrote that money alone sets the world in motion. But money is just paper, or it's numbers on a screen. Gold is a rock. How did we come from understanding that none of this had any value to suddenly injecting all the importance in the world into the concept of money? I'm Kevin Lankus, and today we're going to investigate the origins of money, where it came from, and why. For about 250 years, we've been taught that money came out of a bartering economy. The idea was that before we had money, people had to exchange goods and services to get what they needed. So if you're hungry, you had to make something that a hunter or the caveman Bobby Flay was interested in and hand that over. The person who had the food you wanted also had to like something that you had, and if they didn't, then you had to find someone else and see if they wanted your stuff, maybe caveman Guy Fieri. Then you each had to decide on what the value of both of your stuff was and then come to an agreement on a fair exchange. Money supposedly came in to simplify all this. It was a stand-in for what you possessed but couldn't exchange because someone else didn't want it. So instead, you could give them something that represented the value of your goods, and that's where physical money is said to have come from. The other possibility in the bartering case is that it was an IOU system that proved that you would hand over goods or services at some future point. However, and get ready for this because it is a doozy, in the anthropological record, there is no evidence that money came out of a barter economy, and more shocking still, there's no evidence that a barter economy ever existed in any human culture at all. Ever. Cambridge anthropologist Caroline Humphrey once wrote that no example of a barter economy, pure and simple, has ever been described, let alone the emergence from it of money. All available ethnography suggests that there never has been such a thing. I mean, how crazy is it that the whole thing where we talk about how early humans traded goods and services for other goods and services, and that's how the early economy worked and how we survived way back then, and that's all just complete nonsense. It was just totally made up by the father of free market capitalism, Adam Smith, in his book, The Wealth of Nations. Ever since he published that tome in 1776, we all just went with his ideas about money, and they became the prevailing theory of the economic evolution of human society. The evolution of my personal economic status is that I am very poor. And, donating to my Patreon or buying some super cool LDSFG merch from the website could help change all that around. At the very least, please make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy what I'm doing here so I can keep building momentum. The only time we know of that barter was a large part of trade, and not anywhere near exclusively, of course, was during giant social cataclysms like the fall of the Roman Empire. Access to coins would decrease at those times because they just weren't getting printed anymore, so people sometimes bartered in order to get what they needed. The same thing would happen if there was some kind of apocalypse here in the US. We'd start trading in goods and services, but lots of people would still use paper money because that's what we're used to, and that's what we've all agreed has value, even though it has no intrinsic value on its own. So then, if not barter, where did money really come from? Well, in a literal sense, the first physical coins we know of popped up in the Kingdom of Lydia, now part of Turkey, in the 7th century BCE. Before that, we commonly find that ancient humans used shells to represent money, or sometimes precious metals. Paper money first came about in China somewhere during the early Song dynasty. And I really like that the article from Encyclopedia Britannica where I found this fact goes on to state that paper money was first made from mulberry bark, and it actually makes the joke that technically money really did grow on trees. Conceptually, there's one really cool theory I like about why money was invented that's pretty dark too, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But the truth of all of this is that nobody knows where money came from. The concept of money predates written records. In the Uruk period of ancient Sumeria, we already have all kinds of cuneiform tablets that document everyday transactions. And the Sumerians were super detailed and organized about their record keeping, so we have tons of boring accounting documents. One of the most fun, though, is a 5,000-year-old cuneiform tablet excavated in 2016 that details how many beer rations workers were getting from their employer. So a payslip in beer, which is pretty cool, and suddenly I feel like I've been missing out my entire adult working life. We also have the oldest customer complaint on record in another cuneiform tablet from 1750 BCE. It's from a reseller who's complaining about how a supplier shipped him shitty copper instead of the good stuff he thought he was buying. And a funny story to go along with that, but we also found that exact supplier's house, and there were other tablets in there also complaining about his copper and his delayed shipping times too. Just imagine making a clay tablet with a hollow reed and shipping it off to Jeff Bezos when your Prime 2-day delivery is taking 3 days instead. You son of a... Okay, so lots of early writing that we have access to already assumed the concept of money was widespread. Sadly, that means we may never know where money came from. But the evidence we do have suggests that bartering economies never existed and trade did not come about the way we were taught. Valuables were exchanged for all kinds of reasons. Early human cultures were much more operationally needs-based and communally focused. You had to be or you'd all die. It's only nowadays that we can afford to be selfish. And then we had one selfishly minded philosopher in Scotland write a book in 1776 that then became the foundation for the global economy. And he reverse applied all that sense of selfishness to our ancestral peoples in a way that's just not remotely true or fair. Indigenous peoples of the Americas, like the Haudenosaunee, for example, well, they stocked all of their goods and supplies in longhouses, and then all female councils would allocate those resources when it was necessary to do so. It wasn't about quid pro quo like the revisionist capitalist dirtbags want you to think, so you don't punish them for their wealth-hoarding mental illness. It does appear from the evidence that societies were needs-based early on. You also saw more favor-based economies, and I mean, I'm not sure anyone back then would have even said they really had an economy at all. They just did things for people when they needed it, because otherwise, again, death and sadness. Trading things of value was also discovered in the mating rituals of Indigenous Australians by anthropologists in the 1940s. Men of visiting tribes would be dragged into the bushes by women who lived in the village, and then the men would give the female villagers gifts afterwards, and the women would keep some of them and then also give some of them to their villager husbands. So money didn't really have anything to do with trade or bartering at all in those cases. It served a much more ritualistic purpose, and it felt much more like a colorful bird flashing its feathers at a potential mate. And though it's not an exact parallel because it's much less complicated, it's pretty straightforward and also creepy and much less fun than the Australian example, the dowries of more modern times in the Western world come to mind in comparison. Kind of a similar vibe, although dowries have much more to do with financial transactions and also, of course, the ownership of women. Oof. In terms of the original use of money, there's one particular theory that does make a lot of sense to me, and that's the idea that money originated because of something called Wergild. The word Wergild, or maybe Wergild, translates from a Proto-Germanic dialect to remuneration for a man. It shows up in various forms after that in Old Norse and Old English and other Germanic languages, and it means the same thing throughout. Wergild was a fine that someone had to pay if they materially injured or killed another person. In Germanic nations in the Middle Ages, where the word comes from, there was a complex legal system that developed around it. Different values became assigned for different people over time depending on their class and rank in society. And we actually have the Wergild values from the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, and I'll put those up here. During the 10th century in Europe, it became too logistically complicated to continue to enforce Wergild, so criminals were instead subject to local authorities. And that's where we see more classical corporal punishments spring up like physical torture or death. We can't know for sure without discovering some ancient writings that were previously missed that account for all this, or perhaps if someone gets a hold of a time machine, but some precursor mechanism to Wergild that may have served the same purpose could have spurred the creation of modern money. If Caveman Jim got drunk on fermented tiger eyeball juice and in a rage pushed Caveman Todd off a ledge into the sea, then there would need to be a system in place to both punish Caveman Jim and make sure that Caveman Todd's family was satisfied and cared for. After the advent of agriculture and animal domestication, it's theorized that fines may have been paid in livestock. But more importantly than what specifically was exchanged, the items or objects may have eventually been substituted for a standard currency. Because what happened if you didn't have anything the other party needed? What kind of recompense is that? substitute item could carry a certain attached value that everyone would agree on. Everybody agreed in this case that Caveman Jim only owed Caveman Todd's family just 4 pieces of shiny cave rock glitter because Caveman Todd was kind of a dick after all. Nobody was denying that. One argument I've heard is that Wergild payment was important because it settled early conflicts without further violence. Without Wergild, you might have seen a lot of long-standing conflicts and blood feuds that just went on and on and on, like the famous one that we know of between the Hatfields and the McCoys. Of course, those did happen, and we have evidence for countless blood feuds throughout history. But this is after the creation of money and after the written record, and maybe money was what prevented those happening in early society. Sadly, we'll just never know, but I think that Wergild could be a solid explanation for the creation of something we all take for granted. Unfortunately, this thing that has no real value on its own is responsible for so much grief and pain today. It's important that we understand the complicated history of money and its effects on humanity over time. Analyzing this will help us figure out the questions we need to ask to become the society we want to be. It's important that we don't blindly trust the common sense economic narratives of our formal educations, especially because they simply rehash ideas of hundreds of years ago that have nothing to do with our current circumstances, and that may or may not have ever been true. Conservative economic philosophy is based on a projection of a system of trade that never was. It's nostalgia for a non-existent past. And there are 2 economies out there, one for the rich and one for the rest of us, and I did a video on that if you want to check that out. Even though many things are bullshit, it's important not to fall into the trap of conspiracy either. Just stick to the real data and evidence, always. And let's do some good about rational policy decisions based on actual reality. Analyze and discover the factual evidence. Don't just take things at face value. Unless it's the face of Brutus, because the coin he minted after the assassination of Julius Caesar goes for like $4 million at auction. So yeah, his face is good. Money is paper, gold is a rock. What are we even doing here? The fantasy that barter was the origin for money is said to be just a thought experiment by some economists. The craziest thing about that, though, is that the idea that this thought experiment very likely influenced the creation of our entire modern economy. So daydreaming about the origins of human commerce actually created a whole new rulebook for present human commerce, and it really screwed the vast majority of people. I think that those experimenters should just go back to sleep. Maybe dream something else up, or just, live in reality like the rest of us instead.